While information overload may seem like the result of today's technology, the invention of the printing press fueled its own share of anxiety. 16th century scholars complained there was just too much information to absorb from all those new things called books. Joining us now from Boston, Massachusetts, to explore more of this history, here's Ann Blair. She is the author of Too Much to Know: Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age. She's a professor of history at Harvard University. And Professor Blair, it's nice to see the Charleston Bridge still standing behind you. How's things in Boston these days?
Just great, thanks.
Glad to hear it.
Nice weather so far.
Good to hear. Historically speaking, as we suggested in the intro, we may think this is a 21st century phenomenon, but it's not. Help us fill in the blanks on why it isn't.
Well, it turns out it doesn't take that much. It doesn't take, petabytes of information to make us, an individual human, feel overloaded. And we get this articulation even before printing, but really, I would say around 1500, so 500 years ago, starts a constant refrain of complaining about too many books. Too many books to read them all, too many books to find the books you want to read. And it starts, let's say, for example, with the great humanist Erasmus, who is complaining about these swarms of new books that glut men's minds and will prevent them from reading the good stuff. In other words, people will get, fill up on all the new bad books and then will fail to read the ancient authors, which is what he considers the good books. So everyone in this complaint mode has a judgment generally about too many bad books. And of course, often they're complaining in print, in another book, about the solution to the problem. They are writing a good book.
Do you see any similarities between the way they tried to handle information overload 300 and 400 years ago and the way we try to handle it today?
Right. Well, I think, yes, fundamentally, it's the dynamic of absorbing and then selecting. So filtering by yourself or delegating to a book or another person to do that for you, and finding out what you want and then trying to save it for yourself. So that's where the note-taking comes in. Other forms of saving would be in printed books, for example, where you become an author and you write up the best material you found. So it's all about distilling and making selections based on judgment of what's useful for you or what might be useful to someone else later on or to you later on, and that's, of course, very hard to predict. One of the great differences is often people in the early modern period were accessing a book once, and they wouldn't necessarily own it or be sure of seeing it again. So there's kind of a gather it up now while you have it and save it, and you're not always sure exactly how you're going to use it, and maybe you won't, in fact, use everything you accumulate, but you have a treasury on you. Whereas today, obviously, we can dip into the internet and pull things out without having quite that feeling of wanting to have it on your laptop. Although I am guilty, I have to say, of downloading a lot of things that I want to have them on my laptop. I'm not quite sure they'll be there, in the future.
How much do you think that fear of change was driving all of the criticisms then and today, for that matter?
Right. Well, there was, I would say, first of all, some enthusiasm for printing. People were marveled at how fast you could print a book and how much less expensive it was, as long, of course, as you wanted to have a few hundred copies. Because if you really want just one copy of something, then copying it out by hand might actually be cheaper than printing it. So there is definitely a favorable response at the same time as there's a negative one. And definitely a sense that, some of the grumbling is everyone will pretend to be learned now. What had been a narrow preserve of scholars, access to books, would be much more widely shared, and some people felt that was, a threat to their own standing. This is a very hierarchical society around 1500. Other complaints include the idea that, people are not reading the good books anymore. They're being distracted by all these bad new books, and they're not reading in the same way. They're not reading carefully. They are spreading themselves too thin. And so we get a lot of advice books saying, finish what you start, read thoroughly to the end, memorize your notes. But at the same time, we also get people who are saying, well, take an index, keep an index of the notes you took, which is implying, of course, that you're not going to remember your notes. You're not even going to remember if you took a note on this thing, so you need a record to find your way around your own notes. So that's an acknowledgement that the scale of note-taking is really getting beyond the capacity for you to master your own notes.
I presume that you must have had a smile on your face as you were doing all the research from 300 and 400 years ago, because all the stuff they're saying today, they were saying back then, right?
I agree. I agree. Of course, I know that I'm informed by our current issues as I went back and read these texts. So part of it is how the historian operates, concerned about current, issues and things that seem new, and finding them in the past because you're attuned to them. I don't know that 20 years earlier I would have written the same book. I'm sure I wouldn't, in fact.
Is there a positive angle to this story insofar as, obviously 400 years ago, I guess they thought the brain was only capable of doing so much, but 400 years later, boy, we are just expected for our brains to have capacity to do 25 things at once. And, do you see that in all of this research as well?
Right. I mean, I think obviously one of the messages might be that our brains actually can't do 25 things at once, that they actually do 25 things in short sequence. Mm-hmm. And so the scale of multitasking has obviously increased. Although, frankly, some of these scholars, when you think about all the things they did, they published dozens of books. They, were, say, like Girolamo Cardano, also a practicing physician. They were corresponding abundantly with people all over Europe. They did have helpers. And that's actually the topic of my current project, is who and how they got help, who helped them, people who took notes for them or who wrote letters for them, for example. Nonetheless, they were clearly, a lot of them, big multitaskers.
Even back then, they were multitaskers then. And can you determine what the psychological impact of trying to do all that multitasking, admittedly, nothing in comparison to today, but for the time, which must have been significant?
That's an interesting question. It's very hard to get into the minds themselves. What we see, of course, are their writings. And so we see their complaints. They often talk about being in haste, being rushed, apologizing, of course, for the errors that ensue. So I suppose one classic trope is, please excuse the errors of my book, because I had to make it to the Frankfurt fairs in time to sell it, or it's lacking an index that I meant to include precisely for that reason. So a lot of sense of haste, partly driven by, of course, the need to turn a profit for the printer. So this, even from the beginning, one of the complaints about printing is that printers have an interest in producing books fast, and they're not going to care about quality control. And actually, interestingly, one of the first types of censorship ever suggested, which didn't come to pass, was humanist scholars worrying about errors in bad, poorly edited classical texts that would then spread, hither and yon. And so that's what we need. We need quality control. We need to slow down the production process to make sure that only well-corrected texts are out there. And that didn't stop any of them from printing a ton of works, whether it's for their own desire to share information or partly because printers were urging them on when they were successful authors because they wanted to be able to sell more books by this author. It's hard to weigh. Certainly there's a lot of enthusiasm on the part of my reference books writers to share, to make public, to contribute to the Republic of Letters.
Let me just ask you finally, do you think there's something ironic going on here? Namely, we feel we need to know more, but in some respects, we actually can get away with knowing less because clearly today, everything we need to know is at the touch of a finger.
It's true that you can get all kinds of stuff, but you have to know what to look for, you have to know how to search for it well, and you have to evaluate your returns because a lot of it, needs to be taken with a grain of salt, to say the least, or read critically. So I think you actually still need a backbone, a structure of knowledge. You need to understand how knowledge is created, what kinds of evidence would argue in favor of one thing or the other. What's a reasonable, plausible claim in a certain discipline or another based on how that knowledge is built up so that you're not entirely dependent on the results of a Google search or, which can turn up all kinds of things and even entirely dependent on expert opinion. So I'm really a fan of knowing stuff, actually, even though I agree. And I remember once I got this evaluation, for a teaching evaluation, the professor doesn't know everything. And of course, this was a criticism, and I was sort of crestfallen. And then I said to myself, that's right, the professor doesn't know everything. Sorry. No one knows everything. But what we can try to offer as educators is a sense of how to evaluate and create knowledge for oneself that is reliable, hopefully.
Well, one thing I can say, we know more now. We may not know everything, but we know more thanks to you. So thanks for coming on TVO with us tonight.
Thank you.
Harvard historian Ann Blair, author of Too Much to Know.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.